It is common knowledge that there is a field of energy that underlies all of creation. The first rule, the field is holographic. In a true hologram, every piece contains information about what's called the whole and every other point within that whole. The average human body has about 50 trillion cells, but each of those cells is made of about 100 trillion or so atoms. Every one of those atoms is not a static body, but it is a dynamic field of energy that is constantly emerging from the field and collapsing back into the field. Hello friends, Gregg Braden here. I want to welcome you to this edition of our questions and answers. We try to get to these at least once a week. It's my opportunity to elaborate on some of the concepts that I may have shared in a book or possibly in a television series, an interview that you may have seen, or on some of the panels. There are a lot of scientific panels and summits that are happening these days. And you know, in those formats, I typically have just a very brief time to identify a concept, usually not a lot of time to go into it in depth. So this is my opportunity to do just that. But I'm really excited to do these. I love doing these because what it says to me is that what you're hearing in those books, as you read the books and hear the words in your mind, or as you're watching the panels, or you're watching the summits, or you're watching the television interviews, what it says to me is that what I have shared with you means something to you. It's meaningful in your life. It's so meaningful that you're trying to apply it in your life, and this is where the questions come up. So this is my opportunity to address some of those in a little bit deeper way. I'm going to do something today. It's a little different. I'm going to address two separate yet related questions in this one video. The first question is from Tegan. Tegan doesn't say, I don't know where Tegan is from. Tegan says, Greg, can you explain more of the difference between holograms and fractals? That's a really good question, because both of those terms are tossed around very casually, certainly in our community, in the New Thought community, but even in the scientific community. I see these terms used really loosely. It depends upon what we have experienced as a fractal, or what we've experienced as a hologram. Our experience tends to define how we use these terms. It goes much deeper than that. So I'm excited to answer that. The second question relates to this, and this is from Reagan. Reagan asks, Greg, how does the new model that you have identified as the atom, the quantum atom, differ from the old model of the physical atom, and how do those principles apply to the greater universe? This is a really good question as well, because in many of the programs we will typically use the image of an atom. So in an atom, a mechanical model, it's called the Newtonian atom. In a mechanical model of the atom, what we have is a nucleus and electrons moving around that nucleus. So things moving around the thing, whereas in the new models of the quantum atom, there are no things, there are probabilities of pulses of energy. And the question is, with that new model of probabilities and pulses of energy, what does that mean when we're looking at a solar system, or we're looking at a galaxy, or we're looking at a universe, or when we're looking at our own bodies, because we are made out of those atoms? So very good questions. I'm excited to use some visuals to help flesh out these answers, and that's what we're going to do right now. So when we talk about fractal patterns, and when we talk about the principle of the hologram, these are not occurring in a vacuum. They're not occurring in empty space. They're occurring within the context of a broader field of information. That often is simply called the field. What we're talking about are the rules that allow energy and matter to function within the field that connects all things. And as we know those rules, as we begin to understand the rules of the field, and I'm assuming that most people watching this, that if you're seeing this, it is common knowledge that there is a field of energy that underlies all of creation. This is now accepted in mainstream science. It's no longer controversial that the field exists. In the year 2012, there was a consensus among scientists based upon experiments that were done at the CERN superconducting supercollider in Geneva, Switzerland. An announcement was made that there is in fact a field that underlies our reality. Now, there's a lot of controversy around what the field means, what it means to us, where it comes from. All of the properties of the field are still being explored. But the fact that the field is there is no longer controversial. So I'm going to begin with that assumption. There is a field that connects all things. And the better that we understand the rules that govern that field, the better equipped we are to understand our relationship to the field and to apply those rules in our lives. All right? So that's the preface to what I'm sharing here. Two of the primary rules, there are others, but two of the primary rules that the people have asked about in these questions are the holographic principle and the fractal principle. So the first rule, the field is holographic, and the question comes up, what does that mean? You know, what is a hologram? And I think one of the best ways to maybe to understand this is let me define it first and then let me illustrate what this means. In a true holographic system, every piece of the hologram contains all of the information about every other piece of the hologram. In a true hologram, every piece contains information about what's called the whole and every other point within that whole. Now that's a big concept. That's a huge concept. Let me help you maybe to wrap your mind around this a little bit in a fun way. When the term hologram first really came into the mainstream, it was back in the 1980s when the New Thought community was first emerging. And maybe you remember this. There were bookmarks that were coming out in New Age bookstores. Maybe you've got one today. I've used all of mine in illustrating what I'm about to share with you. I've destroyed all of my all of my bookmarks. But maybe you remember these. They were shiny strips of shiny material, narrow strips of shiny material. And when you would hold the bookmark in the light, the image in the bookmark would appear three-dimensional, as if it were hovering above your hand. And I remember very clearly there was one that was a rosebud. So that rosebud looked like it was a physical rosebud that you were holding in your hand. There were some pretty trippy ones that were out there. There was one with a dolphin jumping over the Great Pyramid of Giza. That was a very popular one. There was one that was the face of Jesus. It was very popular. There was one that was the image of Mother Mary with a shawl and her hands in prayer. That was a very popular one. So here's the point. And I used to be able to do this until I ran out of the bookmarks. If they were truly holographic bookmarks, you could take that beautiful bookmark with a pair of scissors and you could cut it in half. And then you'd take that half and you'd cut it into one of those halves, cut them into a bajillion pieces. And then you could take the smallest one of those pieces and even cut it again and put it under a microscope. And if it was truly a hologram, if it was really a holographic bookmark, in that fraction of a piece, you would still see the whole image of the rose or the dolphin jumping over the pyramid or whatever. And that's the point, because every piece has to contain the entire image. It contains all of the information on the whole, and this is why a hologram is so powerful. It's powerful for a number of reasons. One is that when we have a holographic principle in play, from one little piece of that hologram, we can learn a whole lot about the whole system without exploring the entire system, because the entire system is reflected in that whole. So that is important in terms of gaining knowledge about the system. But where this gets really practical You and I function on the holographic principle. Your blood functions on the holographic principle. Your DNA functions on the holographic principle, and computers now are being built that function on this principle, and here's what I mean. The average human body has about 50 or so trillion cells in the human body. Each of those cells has a nucleus, and within that nucleus is the blueprint for your body, your DNA, and the genes that make up your DNA. Now think about this. If you introduce a change, a mutation, a healthy mutation in your body, or you introduce something in your body that helps you to heal on a genetic level, if that something had to go through every one of those cells in a linear fashion, one at a time, you do the math. I mean, if you took a half a second for each cell, 50 trillion times a half a second, I haven't done the math, but it's going to take some time. But you know that we don't work this way. When we take an antiviral, for example, we're all talking about these now, or an antibiotic, and they begin to work, it doesn't take a whole lot of time for the entire system to reflect the benefit from an antiviral or an antibiotic. Or when you create a shift, an energetic shift in your body through your choice of emotions and the techniques that you are learning to regulate, self-regulate your biology, heart-brain harmony, for example, heart-brain coherence. When you benefit from those, the reason it happens so quickly is because of this principle. Your cells don't have to adapt to change one by one by one by one. In a holographic system, when a change is made in one place, it is reflected in the whole. If that change is truly made in a meaningful way to a holographic system. There's a whole conversation that we can have about that, but I've just given you some examples. So this is the power of the hologram. The universe is holographic. This is how nature communicates information. Probably one of the most amazing examples that come to mind from this, beyond what I'm sharing with you, you've all heard of the 100th monkey principle. And this comes from a scientific study that was done from primates on a number of islands, and I believe they were in the Pacific. They were in the South Pacific. And the anthropologists were studying the habits of primates. In this case, they were chimpanzees. And what they found was that the chimpanzees were having problems finding food, and that they resorted to eating ants that were deep in the earth, in ant hills, and it was hard to get to them. So there was one chimp that did something that had never been seen in any of the chimp communities on any of the islands in the past. He took a stick and he fashioned the stick as a tool, consciously, intentionally fashioned the stick as a tool, put the stick down into the anthill. The ants began to cling to the stick, and when he pulled the stick up, his tool allowed him to have access to those ants in a way that he'd never had before. So this was a pretty cool thing to do, but where the holographic principle comes in is that it wasn't long before the chimps on other islands with no communication physically, they weren't like swimming from island to island. They weren't radioing one another from island to island. But without any visible means of communication, chimps on the other islands began to do the same thing. They learned from the chimp that was innovative and tried something new. That is a beautiful example of the holographic principle. It didn't have to go linearly from island to island. One chimp figured out a new way to do things. It was in the field. It was in consciousness. And all of a sudden, other chimps began to access that consciousness. That is the power of the holographic principle. All right? One of the really fascinating things, and I'm going to address this briefly as we go through this explanation, is that our experience of time is holographic as well. I'm smiling now because I forgot to set my timer. And so I just set the timer, but this may go a little longer. I have no idea how long I've been speaking. So it may go a little longer than what we typically do. Time itself is holographic. Now I want you to think about this. Because time, there's nothing in physics that limits us from moving backward in time as well as forward in time. And there are scientific studies that are happening right now suggesting that we actually do this. When we experience a memory of the past, that a part of us is actually traveling back to that moment in the past. And the reason this is so powerful is because the experiments now are strongly suggesting that from this moment in time, we can go back into our past when we have had trauma, and that we can actually communicate with ourselves in the past to shift our experience of the trauma so that we're healing it in the present moment. Wow, if that isn't a mind blower, I don't know what is. Think about that. It means that if you are a child 50 years ago experiencing a traumatic event and you are feeling alone, if that child senses that there is an acceptance, that there's not a judgment, that the shame of that traumatic experience is being healed in that time, then there is a communication and a mutual healing. The child at that time is being helped as you've gone back into time, and you are being helped because now the trauma of your earlier self doesn't have the same meaning to your adult self. Tremendous studies being done around this. The point is, it's all possible because of the holographic principle, because the field is holographic, because time is holographic. So I hope I'm giving you a sense of what a hologram is and why it's so important. Now, in a hologram, information is stored as patterns, and those patterns are based upon a fractal principle. So now we're going to move to the second part of this. What is a fractal? And this is always interesting to me because people, when they think of fractals, they think of a particular kind of fractal called a Mandelbrot set. I'm going to show you what that is in just a moment. But in general, let me just address the definition of a fractal first, and then I'll give you some of those examples. A fractal is a pattern in nature. It's a fancy word for some people that describes a pattern in nature. And what scientists now know is that as complex as our world appears to be, it is actually based on a very few, just a handful of very simple patterns that repeat again and again and again, but they repeat on different scales. Here's what I mean by that. What you're seeing on the screen right now is electricity. And it is electricity following a preferred path where the resistance is the least. We've all heard this, that energy follows the path of least resistance. In the image you're seeing on the left of your screen, it's lightning in the sky following a path of least resistance flowing through the atmosphere. You can see the pattern. The image on the right is happening at a much smaller scale. This is a neuron in the human brain. It also is an electrical pattern, electrical energy following a pathway of least resistance that's designed to carry electricity. So the neuron is on a small scale, lightning's on a big scale, but you can see the similarity in the patterns because energy is fractal and energy follows fractal patterns. So what we say is that the neuron is a fractal of the lightning. If we understand the way the neuron functions and how energy follows the path of least resistance in the neuron, it gives us insight into how energy flows through the atmosphere and follows that path of least resistance. These are fractal patterns. It's the same pattern on a different scale. Same pattern on a different scale, and that's important. Now, another example that's common, and I've used this, is when we look, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, when we look at the way that electrons flow around the nucleus of an atom. So we say that the electrons have orbits around the nucleus of an atom. This is a physical model. That looks very similar to the way that moons move around a planet, or the way that planets orbit around the sun. But these are very, very different in scale. As you can see, the atom is very small. The moon's moving around another planet. In this case, these are moons moving around Saturn or Neptune. Neptune also is one of the planets in our solar system with rings. That's larger than the atom, but you can see it's the same pattern replicating. And then when we look at planets moving around the sun, it's the same pattern of things moving around things. All right. So what we say is the atom is a fractal of the solar system, or the way that the moons move around a planet is a fractal of the solar system, or maybe the solar system is a fractal pattern of the atom. Okay, so in principle, this is accurate. Now, the question, this is the second question that came up. We now have a different sense for what the atom looks like. Again, I just want to reiterate this. What you're seeing here is the same pattern playing out on different scales. Now, we have a different sense. Technology now has given us deeper insights into what an atom looks like. And while this mechanical model, this Newtonian model of an atom still works in terms of concept, if we're going to, engineer and balance a chemical equation or something like that, it's not really the way that nature works. Now we know that the atom looks more like this. It looks more like pulsing fields of probability rather than physical things moving around a nucleus. So the question is, with this shift in how we see the atom, what does that mean to the way that we think of the other fractal patterns, of planets moving around a sun, or a solar system moving around in a galaxy, the center of the galaxy? Well, this is where it gets interesting, even more interesting, because whether we're talking about moons moving around the planet or we're talking about planets moving around the sun, they are made of atoms. And now we know that those atoms look like this. So when we look into the night sky and we see our moon, or we look through a telescope and we see the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, what we know is we're not really seeing physical things, although they appear physical to us. What we're seeing are collections of what you're seeing on the screen. Pulsing fields of information that appear as solid to us. So what we're saying is it depends upon the perspective. On one level, on the quantum level, these planets and the moons around the planets and the solar systems actually are functioning on this level as pulsing fields of information. And on another level, depending on how we want to engineer them and how we observe them, they are the physical essence of what we see. This is one of the quandaries in physics, because the very famous double slit experiment done early in the 20th century was the first to pose this conundrum, this mystery, because it appears that quantum particles express themselves as waves of energy, which is what you're seeing on the screen right now, until they are observed. And the act of observing the wave collapses it into a particle that becomes the physical reality. So that's another mind blower, and I know you've heard me talk about it and other people talk about it in other programs. I won't spend a lot of time on it here. But the answer is that the new perception of atoms as pulsing waves of probability, pulsing fields of probability, it gives us a deeper insight into the reality that we live in. But where this gets really interesting is when it comes to you and me. I mentioned a moment ago that the average human body has about 50 trillion cells, whatever an average person is. But each of those cells is made of about 100 trillion or so atoms. Every one of those atoms is not a static body, but it is a dynamic field of energy that is constantly emerging from the field and collapsing back into the field, number one. Number two, every one of those atoms is about 99.9 .999999999% empty space. It means that you and I are less physical than we have been led to believe. We're mostly empty space. We appear physical because of the way our brains are perceiving the energy being given off by the atoms. So an atom, when you're talking about an atom, it's less of a thing in time and more of a place in space. And what that means is that you and I are less of a thing and more of a place in space-time. This is why your healing is possible in the way that it is, because your perceptions form the template for the way the atoms are going to express as they emerge and collapse into the field. If you like everything about you, you don't change your perception. If you are choosing a deeper state of healing, for example, or a healthier state of your physical being, or a healthier state of your emotional being, you are one of the rare forms of life, perhaps the only one that we know of on earth, with the ability to consciously choose to shift the way you perceive yourself, so that that shift in perception forms a new template, a new blueprint for the way those atoms are emerging from the field to reflect your new perception of yourself. And the beauty is you don't have to know any of that. I'm answering these two questions and I'm sharing with you the science. But the beauty is you don't need to know that. And there are many really good teachers, really good books, spiritual practices that have been around for 5,000 years that invite us to hold a positive sense of ourselves. Rather than looking in the mirror and focusing on the imperfections, the illusion of the imperfections that you may see, the invitation is to look into that mirror and see yourself in the perfection of your highest vision. Now, people will say, Greg, isn't that lying to yourself? And the answer is no. This comes from a deep understanding of how the quantum field works. You've got to give the quantum field something to work with. If you're looking at yourself, focusing on what you perceive as the flaws and the imperfection, that's what you're feeding into the field. That's the blueprint that the atoms are going to adhere to as they are emerging back into the field to reinforce what your focus is. So when you focus on the image, on the vision, on an altered perception of what you choose to experience in your life, what you're doing, or in your body, the healing in your body is the example I'm using here, but this principle applies to many other things. When you focus on that, what you're actually doing is you are honoring your relationship with the field by giving it something to work with. You're giving it a blueprint, a template of what it is that you would like to experience. The key is, and this is the bottom line for me here, is that we must become in our lives what we choose to experience in the world. We must become the kindness in our lives if we want to experience that kindness from others. We must become the healing that we're asking our bodies to accomplish. And we become those things by assuming that perception in our conscious as well as in our subconscious mind. A lot of work out there from a lot of really good people helping us to do that. All right? So this is the key. Every atom of our bodies is constantly emerging from and collapsing into the field, following the rules of the field. And now you know two of those primary rules, the rules of the holographic principle and the rules of the fractal principle. So I hope that this brief conversation has helped to clarify, number one, the difference between the hologram and the fractals, and number two, the role that they can play in our lives and how we can think about the universe a little differently when we understand these principles, but perhaps most importantly, how those principles apply to us in our lives and our body. Now, this isn't the end, because once we begin understanding the fundamental rules of the field, these begin to help us to understand our potential in the field. But the real beauty is, once we understand our potential in the field, what we begin to see is that we are not bound by the laws of physics as we understand them today. We're not bound by the laws of what are called classical physics, time and space, because in the holographic principle, it's possible to influence the healing and the health of our loved ones in the room next to us, in a home a mile away from us, or in the battlefield in the Middle East on the other side of the planet. And when we begin to accept the power and the responsibility that comes from our relationship to the field, these are deeply held secrets in the esoteric traditions that are not secret any longer, and why should they be? It's about you and me in the world that we live in. And I'll tell you, if we're ever going to embrace the deep truth of who we are and our potential in these fields, I can't think of a better time than right now, when everything that we know and value and cherish is up for grabs, with competing agendas playing out in the world, trying to create different societies and different worlds than we've had in the past. And maybe that's a good thing. I think it depends upon the underlying values of the change. Why are people trying to implement? Why are governments? Why are corporations? Why are they trying to impose these changes upon the way we think of ourselves and our lives? Well, our conditioning is that we've been indoctrinated into a view of ourselves as flawed beings that are powerless victims of our external circumstances. And that certainly may be true if we choose to do nothing about the events that are unfolding in our lives. But in the ignorance of understanding our relationship to the field, many people feel that the only choice they have is to fight back. And when you fight back, that is one way of thinking. It typically creates more suffering for the people that can least afford to have that suffering. Buckminster Fuller, I think, said this the best. He says, you're never going to change the world by fighting against the things you don't like. He said, you want to change the world, find a new model that works better than the old model, and people will begin to follow that new model. The old model simply becomes obsolete and it falls away. I think there's a lot of truth to what Buckminster Fuller said. And what I'm suggesting in these kinds of videos is our world is changing, and there are a lot of reasons for the change. If you want to implement a positive, healthy, new way of thinking, begin to embrace the deep truth of who you are and live this in your life. And what begins to happen is you don't have to fight against the old models because they simply don't make sense anymore. People are pretty sharp, and they'll look around and they want to see who's happier, who's healthier, who has a deeper sense of well-being. And when you're that person in your family or your community, people will notice and they're going to say, I want what you have. How did you do that? And that is the opening for you to share these deep principles of where the spiritual traditions of our past meet the rubber of the road of life. It's where the rubber meets the road. So the spiritual rubber of our past meets the road of everyday life. And it doesn't have to be a deeply philosophical conversation. Once we understand the science, this is a place where science and spirituality come together in a really beautiful way. Once we understand the science, it becomes a lot easier to implement the principles in our lives. So I want to thank you for sharing part of your day with me today. I hope this helps to understand your relationship to the holographic principle, your relationship to the fractal principle, and I hope it's answered those two questions that were shared by Reagan and Tegan. Thank you so much. I look forward to our next.